Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today for another installment of the PRISM seminar series in fall 24. We have Dr. Jules Wood with us today, and Dr. Wood's research focuses on applying quantitative methods to suit the needs of research on issues related to the development of LGBTQ plus adolescents and young adults. Their research combines consideration for developmental issues that may uniquely affect LGBTQ plus individuals, like minority stress, anti-LGBTQ policies at state and local levels, and methodological issues to find optimal approaches for modeling complex developmental processes. Their area of quantitative specialization includes longitudinal modeling, structural equation modeling, psychometric analysis, and methods for intensive longitudinal data. Prior to joining the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, Dr. Wood completed their PhD in Human Development and Family Studies at Penn State, with concentrations in quantitative methodology and individual development. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jules Wood.
Thank you, everybody, for the warm welcome. I'm going to share my screen and get my PowerPoint going and make it so that I can see the time to make sure I'm not rambling too much. I was remarking to the group before everybody joined that this is reminding me of my Zoom teaching days when I was in grad school. I feel like I've lost a lot of those muscles, so apologies if I'm rusty. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Yeah, I'm Jules Wood. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a research assistant professor in the Sexuality, Health, and Gender Center in the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. The Brown School is the School of Social Work and currently public health, although public health is becoming its own school in the very near future. That's a whole thing that does not concern you. And it frankly doesn't concern me because I'm on the social work side. I understand that this is a pretty quanti core of people, although there are diverse interests. I'm hoping that there's also some representation of people doing work with LGBTQ populations, or maybe even just measurement development. So today, what I want to talk to you about, I was trying to think of a good name. So I chose the title Measurement Matters. Measurement matters in the sense that, doing quality measurement development of psychometrics matters when we're, actually making our measures, but also measurement matters for populations who are marginalized to some degree, who have unique experiences that wouldn't necessarily be covered in general measures. So I'm going to talk to you about the development of two scales, one for gender dysphoria and one for minority stress in trans and non-binary adolescents. This is the first project actually that I took an analytical lead on when I joined this group. So I really have to give acknowledgement and thanks to the other contributors to this task project. Doctors Jeremy Goldbach and Sherry Schrager are sort of the leads on this. Dr. Rory O'Brien, who's at University of Michigan, helped a lot. Dr. Shannon Dunlap did the initial qualitative studies that sort of led to the creation of these two measures. And Dr. Harmony Rhodes was a colleague on this as well. I also want to share my thanks to my colleagues at the Shag Center, one of whom is in the chat right now, Josh. I think he just wanted to learn more about the task measures. We have a lot of wonderful people here. It's a very exciting group to work with. And also my thanks to our participants for sharing their perspectives and experiences with us and helping us to develop quality measures, hopefully, for the future. And thanks to you for listening today. So given that this is a more general group, I want to go over some key terms just to make sure we're all on the same page. So first, gender minority stress or minority stress in general is excess stressors experienced by members of gender minorities due to pervasive anti-LGBTQ cultural attitudes compared to cisgender people. So minority stress theory comes from the health disparities research field as a way of explaining why members of minority groups exhibit excess levels of health issues. So the idea is that the sort of stress and marginalization that you experience as a minority contributes to decreased health. Um, Minority stressors can be internal or external. An example of an internal minority stressor could be something like anxiety about how people are going to accept you as in your gender identity, like anxiety about being rejected, or even internalized transphobia, like an internal belief that being trans is somehow wrong or inferior. An example of an external stressor are sort of classic victimization. So you could be bullied by your peers at school, your family could reject your gender identity and want you to change. Stressors can also be proximal or distal. So proximal meaning that they occur in your sort of immediate everyday life. So that's, like being bullied, like being rejected, like potentially being thrown out of your home. Distal sort of referring more to like society level things. So it could be like your school's policy to not let you use the locker room that aligns with your gender identity, or state level policies, even national level policies that are affecting trans and non-binary youth. Um, and of course, the distal stressors filter down into our everyday lives. Gender dysphoria, I'll give you the DSM-5's definition. I'll acknowledge that the concept of gender dysphoria is a little bit controversial, but the DSM-5 defines it as incongruence between your gender assigned at birth and your experienced or expressed gender, as well as clinically significant distress or impairment in some kind of functioning in your life due to that incongruence. So there's sort of two components. One is the incongruence that you experience between your sort of the gender that everybody assumes you are, like based on your sex assigned at birth, and the gender that you experience within yourself or wish to express. And then also the stress impairment infection. The distress part is a little bit controversial because many trans and non-binary people experience the incongruence part, but don't necessarily experience a great amount of distress or impairment, but would still classify themselves as having gender dysphoria and wanting access to gender affirming, whether it be medical care, just gender affirming, environments in general. And then finally, I'm using a very umbrella definition of trans and non-binary. I like this because it's inclusive of a lot of different identities. So when I say trans and non-binary, I am referring to people whose gender identity is different from their sex assigned at birth, right? The sex that appears on your birth certificate as male or female based on, what a doctor is able to see externally about you when you're born. I like this because this includes both binary trans people, so people who are assigned male at birth and identify as female, or people who were assigned female at birth and identify as male. It includes non-binary people who may have been assigned male or female at birth, but identify outside the gender binary, and agender people who don't particularly identify with any gender. And also, if I slip up and just say trans, some people will also use the label trans as inclusive of non-binary people. So if I say trans, I mean trans and non-binary in this sort of umbrella fashion. So yeah, like I said, I'm going to talk to you about two scales, one for gender dysphoria, one for minority stress. And a question that a lot of people have about this is, why do we need adolescent-specific scales for these things? We've submitted these as papers, and this is certainly a comment that we got from the reviewers on one of them. The other was accepted without revision, which is crazy. I feel like that never happens. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm getting spoiled early in my career. So I can tell you why we need adolescent-specific scales. Trans and non-binary adolescents experience elevated behavioral health risk compared to their cisgendered peers, and this includes cisgendered sexual minority peers. So there are unique stressors associated with being a gender minority that aren't necessarily the same stressors that are associated with being a sexual minority. So this we know that there is a health disparity here, and gender-related minority stress and dysphoria are likely contributors to these health disparities, especially minority stress sort of degrading the quality of life, but also gender dysphoria is a significant cause of stress, and if it's not addressed with gender affirming care in some way, would also lead to issues, with your overall health and well-being. Adolescence is a unique developmental period. I think we all know adolescence is kind of something else from adult life. So as a unique developmental period, it includes specific opportunities for minority stressors and dysphoria experiences. So a lot of things are happening and changing for adolescents, and there are unique things that adolescents experience that adults don't necessarily experience. So the obvious one is school being a very salient context in which you have to go. You don't have a lot of choice about whether you're at school. Well, I guess you do, but it's, that's called truancy if you decide to go to school. So the school context is very salient. Family context is salient, peers. And then with regards to dysphoria, especially, adolescence is a period of pubertal development when a lot of dysphoria experiences can arise due to the ways that your body is changing if you're not receiving puberty blockers or hormones, if that is a thing that you wish to receive. And I think that it's really salient, especially to consider adolescent-specific experiences in the US, but also all over the world right now, because there's a lot of policy decisions that are affecting trans and non-binary adolescents. So here I pulled up maps of states that have trans sports bans. So states where transgender students cannot participate in sports consistent with their gender identity. They have to, if they're allowed to participate at all, they have to participate with the team consistent with their sex assigned at birth, which is not something that a lot of trans people want to do. And then we also have states with bathroom bans, which you can see this one is a little bit more information, and I've included references. You can look at these maps in more detail, but some states have decided to ban trans people from using bathrooms and facilities consistent with their gender identity, specifically at K-12 schools. So these are laws that are targeting adolescents specifically. Those are the laws that have proven sort of easier to pass than like all out, like no trans person can use any bathroom consistent with their gender identity. I think only Utah and Florida have laws to that effect. And just like the sports thing and the bathroom thing is sort of a non-inclusive list of all of the issues that are currently facing trans and non-binary youth. We have states that are specifically banning access to gender affirming care or gender affirming medical care, including Missouri. Missouri has a trans youth healthcare ban. So in the state of Missouri, you cannot, if you are a trans adolescent, you cannot receive hormone blockers or hormone replacement therapy, unfortunately. So I think it's very salient actually to really specifically be developing a measure for adolescents. That like they are specifically being targeted in the US right now and experiencing things that adults wouldn't experience. So that's kind of my piece on the minority stress. The issues with a lot of dysphoria scales, and I'm going to get into sort of the sort of spicy critiques in my next slide, but dysphoria measures that are developed for adults, well, one, they don't bring into, like, they don't consider the sort of unique stressors of puberty and your body developing in ways that you're not a fan of, because adults have already gone through puberty. But dysphoria measures have a lot of other issues that I think are fair grounds for critique. A lot of them assume binary transgender identities and aren't geared towards non-binary respondents at all. Like they will specifically use language around like I desire, like around being male or female exclusively with no wiggle room. A lot of them assume medical transition is a desired goal and will kind of bake that into the measure, and not all trans people desire medical transition. And even within categories, trans feminine, trans masculine, like transition goals aren't the same for all trans people. And for non-binary and agender people, some people do desire medical transition, some people don't. So we shouldn't be assuming that that the ideal trans body is the same for everybody. A lot of them tend to conflate gender minority stress with the stresses of gender dysphoria. So they'll include items like, when people misgender me, I feel sad. And that is more of a minority stressor of people ignoring your pronouns versus the stresses of gender dysphoria. Like there's some argument that there's like a bit of overlap between sort of the interpersonal social elements of your interactions sort of exacerbating dysphoria, but those concepts should be more separate than they generally are. And then another really basic thing from a measurement development perspective is that a lot of gender dysphoria measures lack comparable forms for assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth respondents. Like they're not even parallel forms, they're just different forms with different questions. And I think that our stats friends know that that's kind of a cardinal sin, that's a deal breaker. So I put the spicy stuff up front. Hopefully that helps you wake up this fine morning. I'm going to go through some specific critiques of existing scales. So one is that there's not really many scales, or really there is, to our knowledge, no scale for gender minority stress developed for adolescents. The one scale that exists for gender minority stress in trans and non-binary people is the Gender Minority Stress and Resilience Measure. It's developed in adults. It includes 9 subscales that range from rejection to non-affirmation to more positive concepts like pride and community connectedness. The response options aren't consistent between subscales, and really the subscales all stand alone. It's not a unified measure. The content of the subscales is actually pretty good, in my opinion. It's just not a, it's not a it's not a single measure of minority stress. It's kind of all of these disparate things. Gender dysphoria, I have some more pointed critiques for. So the Utrecht Gender Dysphoria Scale originally was developed with AFAB and AMAB versions, non-parallel. I mean, you can see that's pretty old, 1997. In 2020, they attempted to make it sort of more inclusive by essentially taking the 2 versions that existed, combining them, and then wording some questions more broadly, so as to not point to assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth people specifically. Although this, would be things like I dislike the functions related to my sex assigned at birth, so like in parentheses erections or menstruation, whereas those were separate questions, which is sexual functioning and menstruation, like those are kind of different things that people may or may not have issues with. And so I think that there's, even though they made some attempts to make it more inclusive, there are issues to be found still with the UGDS. The Gender Identity Dysphoria Questionnaire for adolescents and adults only has assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth versions. They are non-equivalent. And also Kenneth Zucker is an author on this scale, and he is a known proponent of conversion therapy. So this scale is quite controversial in the area, I will say. Both the gender dysphoria scales that are available have been critiqued for being overly binary, focusing on the diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria rather than looking at socio-emotional stressors, and also conflating minority stress with dysphoria. And we do have empirical evidence to back up that these scales aren't really serving the needs of the population. In a recent study by actually my colleague Pascalupo and Lex Poltis-Ferro, only 54% of trans and non-binary respondents said that both of these scales captured their experiences as trans and non-binary people. So there's certainly room for improvement in how the field is measuring gender dysphoria. And I will also say at this point, our purpose of creating a gender dysphoria scale was not to create a clinical instrument. So we're not trying to measure whether somebody is quote unquote trans enough to be able to access medical care or be able to access gender affirming care. We're not even trying to establish whether they meet like the technical DSM-5 criteria for gender dysphoria. We approach this as more of a conceptual measure that was able to operate outside of the boundaries of the clinical definition. So our measures, what makes our measures better? Well, they went through quite an extensive development process that started and in a lot of ways that incorporated the feedback of trans and non-binary adolescents at multiple stages. So the starting point were these life history interviews with trans and non-binary adolescents. This was part of Dr. Shannon Dunlap's dissertation work. So even though it's with a small sample pool, from these interviews, we generated an initial item pool. And then from there, we moved into a modified Delphi process, which is basically like an expert panel review. So we convened 6 experts in relevant areas, including gender dysphoria, minority stress, people from the medical side of things, from the psychology side of things, from the psychometric side of things. And they took the large pool of initial items and rated each item for content validity. So whether, an item that was supposedly about minority stress, if somebody was experiencing minority stress, they would likely endorse it. And also feasibility, which was whether an adolescent could comprehend the question and answer it accurately. So for the items that everybody agreed were valid and feasible, that handful of questions was automatically passed on. For all the other questions, there were additional meetings to discuss and refine the items. So some items, actually quite a lot of items, were added at this stage. Some items were reworded, some items were left out. So this was sort of the majority of the work of refining the initial pool. But we don't want to end with just a bunch of PhDs sitting in a room. We took the item pool that we've identified from the modified Delphi process and brought them back to some trans and non-binary adolescents who rated the items for clarity, offensiveness, and also applicability in their own lives. So everybody who's written a test ever, I'm sure, knows sometimes you write what you think is a really good item, and then you get a bunch of questions from people when you're actually in the room taking it of like, what does this mean? So that's kind of the clarity bit. Offensiveness, trans and non-binary adolescents might be able to give us sort of community like cultural standards of questions that they consider offensive or that a lot of trans and non-binary adolescents might consider offensive. And this is a population that we don't want to offend when we're trying to ask them about these very, sort of, sensitive experiences that they might have. Like, I think it sort of belies it might decrease trust in researchers. And then we also don't want to ask them questions that they don't feel like they could actually encounter in their real life. So some items were removed, reworded, And a couple of items were also added at this stage. I think specifically they were questions about body hair and facial hair for gender dysphoria. And then we move on to the psychometric analyses, which is where I came in, both like in terms of my duties and also temporally. The everything up until this point happened before I joined the team. So I'm kind of telling you about what I know about what happened, but I wasn't there for the actual discussions. But for psychometric analyses, we did a pretty standard process. So first you do a structural analysis, trying to identify the subscales, trying to identify what the common themes are in your item pool. So that's, doing factor analysis. Then once you think you have a pretty good idea of what the structure of your measure is, doing measurement and variance analysis across demographic features. So making sure that the properties of the items are going to be equally applicable to everybody who could possibly take your survey. So like, especially you want measurement and variance across things that shouldn't matter to your constructs, like race, ethnicity, regionality, but also things that kind of could matter to the average, like mean level of your constructs, like pubertal development, gender identity. You want to make sure that you're doing an equally good job measuring everybody. And then very typically, like just looking at the reliability of the items, and also validation, looking at how well they concord with the existing measures of gender dysphoria and minority stress, and whether they are doing a good job of predicting the health disparities that we know are associated with minority stress and gender dysphoria. So that brings me to the meat of the actual study that I'm going to talk about today. We recruited 444 US-based trans and non-binary adolescents. They were recruited online and in such a manner that it was roughly equal representation across all areas of the United States. As you can see, I put the demographics over here. So yes, they were a majority white, but some race and ethnic diversity. With respect to pubertal development, we had to do some combination of some things. So we categorized this as basically people who did not have significant pubertal development yet, people who had significant pubertal development but had not taken blockers or hormones, and then people at any level of pubertal development who had experience taking puberty blockers or cross-sex hormone replacement therapy, just because we didn't have a lot of people who had taken blockers or hormones. Sex assigned at birth, about 75% female, 25% male. We have a range of sexual identities and also a range of gender identities, which we categorized as transmasculine, transfeminine, non-binary, and agender. So these are the categories that we used for measurement and variance testing. In terms of the measures, of course, we had our pilot measures for the TAS minority stress and TAS dysphoria. For behavioral health, we have depression, anxiety, suicidality, and also substance use. For gender minority stress, we had the measure I talked about previously, the GMSRS and all of its many, many subscales, and also the sexual minority adolescent stress inventory, or the SMASI, which is a measure developed also by this team for minority stress in sexual minority adolescents. And for gender dysphoria, the two measures that I talked about before, the UGDS and the GIDYQ. So I'm going to talk through the minority stress scale kind of beginning to end and then switch to dysphoria. So out of 69 candidate items, we asked, these were yes, no, whether you had experienced the items ever and in the past 30 days, although for the measurement development part, we only looked at the lifetime, the ever scores. And from this, we identified 3 subscales. So one that we called disaffirmation. So some sample items from that is people have told me that I'm not really trans or non-binary. And then also these sort of more structural things, like I was not allowed to use the locker room at school that matched my gender. there were also questions about bathrooms, and then there were questions that were also like, I have been afraid to use the bathroom at school that matches my gender identity. So it's not just like, were you allowed, but also were you kind of anxious to, because, you could experience, some kind of victimization or even violence if you did that. A scale that we called visibility and internalized trans negativity. So this included items like, I've been afraid of others finding out that I am transgender or non-binary. I've been afraid to date because I'm transgender and non-binary. And then also sort of more internalized trans negativity, like I felt embarrassed about being transgender or non-binary, or I've felt like being trans or non-binary was wrong in some way. And then the third area that we identified was sort of family-related minority stressors. So like my parents tried to stop me from being trans or non-binary, or a family member told me to present as my assigned sex to certain people. So these are largely kind of like disaffirmation, but specifically in the family context, whereas the school context showed up more in the disaffirmation subscale. So talking about the measurement properties, we did measurement invariance across all the subgroups that I talked about. Just little brief measurement 101, the kinds of measurement invariance that we considered are configural, where you have the same pattern of factor loadings for each of the subgroups. Metric is a little bit stricter, where you have equal factor loadings. And then this isn't the strictest, but a stricter form of measurement invariance is scalar, where you have both equal factor loadings and either item intercepts or thresholds, depending on whether you have continuous or binary items. So we were looking to at least have metric invariance, if not scalar invariance, so that we know that we can kind of compare the means of these scores, and that, at least with metric invariance, that the items are contributing to the factor in the same way for all members of a subgroup. So at this stage, some items were removed for contributing to measurement non-invariance across sex assigned at birth and gender identity. Like I was forced to present my gender differently when at a place of worship, and I had to sneak around my family to access community resources that supported my gender. I mean, these aren't to say that these aren't minority stress experiences. It's just that they appear to be minority stress experiences that affect assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth people a little bit differently. So they're sort of functioning not in the same way for the purposes of building this scale. And then the reliability was generally good, using this kind of composite reliability for binary items measure, looking at each subscale. The reliability was above 0.85. We also did some limited test retest reliability. So this is just basically trying to see if people are giving us the same answers 2 weeks after taking the initial survey, and those correlated by 0.81. So did our minority stress measure agree with the existing minority stress measure? So scales, sorry about the wall of correlations, but the scales of the GMSR that were associated with like rejection, victimization, negative expectancies, non-disclosure, the kind of minority stress experiences that are also present in our scale, correlated fairly highly with our whole scale, and especially disaffirmation and visibility and internalized trans negativity. The family scale we're maybe seeing isn't as represented in the content of the GMSR, and that's because it was developed for adults. Where asking about their family probably isn't a salient. I guess we do see some sort of discriminant validity in that the TAS-MS wasn't particularly associated with pride or community connectedness. And we do see quite high correlations with the SMASI, which is the Sexual Minority Adolescent Stress Inventory, with the caveat that the SMASI, this is maybe getting a little too far into the weeds of its development process. The SMASI was developed only on cisgender sexual minority adolescents. but all the items are phrased around being LGBTQ. So it doesn't have the specificity of like experiencing discrimination or experiencing issues because of your sexual identity versus your gender identity. So moving forward, I think we could do perhaps a better job of differentiating the two of those. And also, like, it might be hard for adolescents to differentiate whether they're being bullied or rejected by their family, or, experiencing these issues because they are a sexual minority or a gender minority in the cases where they might be both. Some selected findings. The overall headline of this, I'll try to move things along for the sake of time, is that the TAS-MS and its subscales were associated with higher psychopathology symptoms, so higher depression, higher anxiety, higher PTSD symptoms, and also greater risk for suicidality, ideation, attempt, and non-suicidal self-injury. All of these were significant. All the regression estimates are standardized, so you get a sense of the sort of the effect. So I don't have a ton to say here other than this is roughly what we expected, that the TAS-MS and all of its subscales are explaining they're not explaining health disparities between gender minorities and cisgendered sexual minorities or cisgendered heterosexual peers, but people with higher levels of minority stress are reporting higher levels of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and suicidal behaviors. So, okay, moving on to the TAS dysphoria, we initially had 20 candidate items. Asking youth whether they experience certain things. And then if they endorsed the item, they were asked to rate how much distress it caused them, from 0 being none at all to 10 being the worst possible distress. So this is disaggregating that, disaggregating the distress component with the incongruence component of gender dysphoria. And I guess we're leaning a little bit higher on the distress side, because if people didn't endorse an item, that was coded as 0 distress. But it does give people the option to say that they experience something, but it causes them no or very little distress, as opposed to assuming that if you experience something, it must be causing you distress, or that you must experience distress to experience some element of gender dysphoria. So you could break these scores down a little bit more if you were interested in just like the pure binary, do you experience this, yes, no, or you can look only at the distress component. So based on this, we identified 2 subscales. One is sort of the classic body-related dysphoria. So this is items like the size of my chest does not match my gender identity, and sort of a more adolescent-specific one, my body is developing in ways that do not match my gender identity. One thing to note here is that we really tried hard to make everything applicable to all possible identities. So size of my chest could mean breasts or lack thereof. We don't make any specific references to sex traits for assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth people. Then the other subscale that we identified is sort of more of the like socio-emotional component of dysphoria that we call gender expression related burden. There's a lot of sort of long subscale names here. I apologize, but this meant things like making my appearance match my gender identity is exhausting. And I worry I will never be seen as my gender identity, which I like as sort of a future-oriented item that hypothetically will be reduced as people receive gender affirming care, if that's something that they desire. Measurement properties here, again, we did the measurement and variance analyses, looking for anything that contributed to like significant non-invariance. So at this stage, we excluded one item. I wish that my body had gone through puberty that matched my gender instead of my sex assigned at birth. That was contributing to invariance across gender identity and also pubertal development experience with blockers hormones. So, right, if somebody has been on puberty blockers and moves to hormone replacement therapy, their body doesn't go through a puberty that is sort of determined by their sex assigned at birth and rather matches their gender identity. And then also within gender identities, like this was contributing to non-invariance when we had non-binary and agender people, because what does a non-binary or agender puberty mean exactly? Like the truth is that there would be diversity of opinions on what kind of pubertal development a non-binary or agender person might desire. Like they might like some of the results of their sort of endogenous puberty, like the puberty that they would go through anyway, or whereas like at the same time other elements of that puberty could be distressing. So that was an item that was not serving all the identities and populations that we wanted to. It was a little bit, we had a lot of discussion around this scale because there were some items that exhibited non-invariance across gender identity, sex assigned at birth, pubertal development, but were deemed sort of too core to dysphoria experiences, like my genitals do not match my gender identity. Again, you can kind of see that as applying to binary trans folks, but what does non-binary genitals mean or agender like genitals mean? It, like, again, opinions will differ. However, this was sort of deemed as too core to the binary gender dysphoria experience. So, like there are maybe sort of population level mean differences in dysphoria and also in minority stress that kind of need further looking at. But reliability was good for the Cron box alpha, overall 0.9. At least over 0.85 for the body and the burden subscales. And the 2-week test retest, also people generally gave us the same answers, which again, like, I mean, they were giving us answers on a 10-point scale, so hopefully they were relatively consistent. Comparing this to the existing measures of gender dysphoria, I guess, well, we see positive correlations for the UGDS. For the GIDYQ, actually lower levels of the GIDYQ mean higher gender dysphoria, so that's why the negative association. So you can see that the body subscale was really kind of more highly correlated with the existing scales than the burden subscale, which kind of gets at, you know, those scales being largely about body functioning and like the clinical criteria rather than the sort of emotional burden of having to express your gender identity and try to get other people to agree to respect your gender identity. And worrying about, you know, whether you're ever going to be seen as your gender identity. And again, like the task minority stress, all the dysphoria global scale, as well as the body and the burden subscale, were associated with higher depression, anxiety, PTSD symptoms, as well as suicidal ideation, attempt, and non-suicidal self-injury. The effect size for suicidality maybe not as strong as the minority stress effect sizes were, but this is still in line with our hypotheses. So, all right, I managed to time this out pretty well despite not doing a full run through TBD. So limitations of this, I will acknowledge our sample was majority assigned female at birth, non-Hispanic white, living in urban areas. This is maybe not representative of the US population as a whole, but it is consistent with other nationwide surveys of trans and non-binary adolescents and challenges with recruitment of that population. We did have sufficient sample sizes to do our measurement and variance analyses, But if you wanted to look at maybe more complex within group differences, you would have to do a very targeted recruitment. And I'm just kind of laughing because I know my colleague Josh Russo is on the call watching this. We're recruiting for a study of intimate partner violence in LGBTQ adolescents broadly, and we are having exactly this issue of heavily AFAB, heavily non-Hispanic white, heavily urban people responding to our survey and really struggling to recruit people who do not fit into one of those demographics. There was some measurement non-invariance present in both scales that I think points to population or contextual differences in minority stress experiences and dysphoria. So we would need sort of further investigation of what those like average differences may be, but you have to have a good scale to be able to do that. So I think that we have a strong scale that can actually address average like population differences. And sort of getting into the future directions now, both of these measures were developed for use in the general population. We have reason to believe that they're fine and applicable to clinically engaged trans and non-binary adolescents, but that's a consideration that some people make. We're actually currently working on a paper using a sample from WashU's pediatric transgender clinic, which unfortunately the recruitment for that was curtailed by Missouri's ban of gender affirming care for youth. Happened right in the middle. So we kind of were getting some people, and then the clinic basically shut down. Yeah, like they weren't allowed to do puberty blockers or HRT anymore for youth. But at least from the measurement perspective, it seems like the task measures are totally fine. With the interesting caveat, although it's sort of totally expected when you think about it, is that there was really, really low endorsement of the family minority stress items. And I say that makes sense if you think about it, because in order for youth to get to the pediatric transgender clinic, you have to have a pretty supportive family, or at least one pretty supportive parent that is, willing to believe you about your gender identity and seek out care, and also like deal with like the years-long wait lists at the clinic. So by the time you get to the clinic, you have to be pretty supportive, pretty engaged. And then sort of the next step with these measures, and also just like trans and non-binary research in general, would be to do a longitudinal study to look at how minority stress and dysphoria change over the course of adolescence and moving into young adulthood. I would especially like to do these studies with regards to access to gender affirming care. So whether somebody gains access to gender affirming care, and you would expect that maybe some elements of minority stress are relieved, and certainly gender dysphoria would be relieved, or whether access was taken away. I would also love to look at this with respect to policy changes in trans-related laws. So, if your state bans your ability to go to bathroom at school, that will certainly increase the amount of stress that you experience. So I think that these are going to be very useful skills for looking at how the sort of larger, not just the sort of classic adolescent development components of this, but how the larger landscape of policy in the US is shaping experiences that adolescents are having. So in conclusion, I hope that I've convinced you relatively well that the TAS-MS and TAS-D are valid and reliable scales for minority stress and gender dysphoria in adolescent gender minority populations. They demonstrate pretty good measurement and variance across gender identity, sex assigned at birth, and pubertal development. Importantly, they do not assume binary gender identity or that medical transition is a universal goal for all people. And they incorporate key adolescent-specific contexts that aren't necessarily present in scales developed for the adult population. So, okay. Yeah, I still have a little bit of time for questions, and you can contact me at this email If you want more information or if you want my slides, the TASD is actually published, and the TAS-MS I submitted a revision of earlier this week. So hopefully that is also coming to a journal near you soon. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jules. If anyone has any questions, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask them.
I have a question. Jules,
Hi,
hi, wonderful presentation. And I guess I have a lot of questions, but I'll start with one. Just to go, can you speak a little bit more in terms of how your measure of trans non-binary adolescent gender dysphoria, how does that fit in with kind of the fluidity of identity development that happens in adolescence?
Yeah. Hold on one second. I have a hidden slide that shows all the items. So yeah, great question. Adolescence is, it's not just a period where you're going through puberty and you're experiencing all the adolescent things. But also adolescents are figuring out, their identities in a lot of respects, and that can include gender identity. I don't know that the dysphoria scale should be applicable to a wide range of gender identities. And kind of get at embodiment goals of people, like is sort of incongruence between your body and your sort of desired body for your gender identity, and then also just like the work that you're doing to make your body and gender expression kind of in line with what you want. So I think that should, I don't know, more research would really be needed to see if, like, as people as people sort of explore and refine their gender identity, whether they sort of uncover or resolve gender dysphoria, or whether gender dysphoria might be relatively stable as people might refine, do I identify as agender? Do I identify as non-binary? Do I identify as a demi-girl? There's many categories, and people, especially working with adolescents, we see that adolescents kind of, they might be gaining new information and like learning new language to describe how they feel. I can kind of say, just to share a personal anecdote, I certainly, when I was growing up, non-binary wasn't a term that I heard at all. I didn't hear it until I was in my 20s, and I was like, oh dang, that is something, like that's how I felt my whole life. But even before then, like even when I, would have said that I was a cisgender woman, I certainly would have identified certain things about my body that made me feel uncomfortable, and that didn't change. As I sort of explored my gender identity and refined what label I might give to myself.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Pat?
So congratulations on a lot of work, and I really like the goal of having measures that can be used broadly to compare people. I want to ask a question, and then, because I'm an old person, make a recommendation. I'll start with the recommendation. First of all, as much as you've done, I hope you don't give up, because it seems like this is evolving, and construct validation goes hand in hand with measurement. And so the more you measure, the more constructs develop. And so I hope that this isn't just the end of the road. And then a suggestion, a comment. When it comes to stressors, they seem quite different from distress. So distress is, what we often think of as a reflective model, that people are distressed and they report the distress with different items that are correlated. But the correlation among those items all comes from the common source of distress. But stressors might more be like a formative model, where you don't necessarily expect that stressors that can occur, say, in Missouri
Yeah.
are going to be also occurring in New York or San Francisco, but there could be other stressors there, so that stressors accumulate. And so the work on looking at formative models, I think, is challenging. I think people are still trying to figure out how to do, say, something like measurement variance. Anyway, so have you considered formative models when it comes to stressors? And if so, are they off the table, or are you still considering them?
I think that, yeah, so you certainly our items speak to distress. I just popped up the full TAS-MS items if people are curious. So yeah, some of these kind of speak more to anticipation, like feeling uncomfortable using the bathroom, the locker room, at school, versus things that are like distinct stressors, like teachers using the wrong pronouns for me, being harassed by my peers, you know, dealing with family things. Yeah, your point taken that probably from like a formal stress standpoint, there's some mixing of concepts here. My experience is that that's kind of generally the case in minority stress world, that there is like specific stress experiences, and then there's also this like anticipatory, like I am worried that something bad could happen to me if I was open about my identity, or I was recognized as my identity in certain contexts. But formative model, I will make a note of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing. So we're right up at 11 a.m. So if everyone can join me in thanking Jules for their time. Really appreciate you coming and talking to us today.
Thank you. This was delightful.